The radio crackled with static, then silence. Colonel Marcus Voss stared at the tactical display in the operations center, watching the blue icon representing Warthog 27 flicker and disappear from the screen. Around him, junior officers held their breath. The Afghan mountains had swallowed aircraft before, but never like this. Never with 30 seconds of screaming alarms followed by absolute nothing. Voss removed his headset slowly, the weight of command pressing down on his shoulders like wet concrete. Outside, the Bagram tarmac shimmered in 100-degree heat, F-16s lined up like silver monuments to American air power. But 12 miles north, somewhere in the Kush ridgeline, an A-10 Thunderbolt II had vanished mid-strike, and with it, the pilot everyone had underestimated since the day she arrived. Her call sign was Anthem. Real name: Captain Lyra Cade, 31 years old, 5'4", with a reputation that preceded her like distant thunder. She'd flown close air support missions over Helmand Province when half the squadron was still in flight school, had put ordnance on targets so close to friendly forces that ground commanders requested her by name. But here at Bagram, among the fighter jocks and fast movers, she was the Warthog driver, the pilot of the ugly, slow plane that belonged to a different era. They called it affectionate. She knew better. The mission brief had been routine. Taliban fighters massing in a canyon network, coalition forces pinned down, danger close authorization granted. Anthem and her wingman Hawk had rolled in at 14,000 feet, the Hindu Kush spreading below them like crumpled brown paper. Her A-10 was a flying tank, titanium bathtub protecting her from ground fire, 7 tons of ordnance slung beneath crooked wings. Beautiful in the way scars are beautiful. Functional, unforgiving. Then came the shoulder-fired missile, a white contrail rising from a ridgeline they'd already cleared. Hawk saw it first. His warning came half a heartbeat before impact, before Anthem's world became fire and grinding metal, before her right engine exploded and the controls went stiff in her hands. The last transmission anyone heard was her voice, steady despite the chaos, reporting hydraulic failure and initiating emergency procedures. Then static. Colonel Voss looked at the empty screen and made the calculation commanders always make. Recovery mission, maybe. But realistically, they were looking for wreckage now, not a pilot. He reached for the phone to notify Dover Air Force Base to set in motion the machinery of grief. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Anthem had disappeared on purpose. The canyon walls blurred past at 300 knots, close enough that Lyra could see individual rock striations, ancient geological layers that had witnessed empires rise and collapse. Her A-10 shook like a paint mixer, the remaining left engine screaming at maximum thrust, while the dead right engine trailed smoke like funeral incense. Warning lights illuminated the cockpit in angry reds and yellows, a Christmas tree of catastrophic failures. She descended below radar coverage deliberately, threading the aircraft through a narrow gorge that shouldn't have accommodated wingspan this wide, that would have terrified any sane pilot into ejecting. But Lyra wasn't operating on sanity anymore. She was operating on something deeper, something forged in childhood nights when her father never came home from his deployment, when her mother's face became a study in controlled devastation. The missile had struck during her attack run, right as she'd pickled her AGM-65 Mavericks onto the Taliban position. She'd felt the impact through the airframe, heard metal scream, watched her right engine instruments plummet to zero. Standard procedure called for immediate egress from hostile territory, climb to altitude, attempt restart or eject over friendly terrain. But below, through the smoke and chaos, she'd spotted something that changed everything. A second Taliban position, massive, 20 to 30 fighters with heavy weapons aimed directly at the valley where Alpha Company had established their observation post. The same observation post where Lieutenant Marcus Chen and his platoon were pinned down, low on ammunition, waiting for extraction that wouldn't arrive in time. Chen, 24 years old, West Point graduate, who'd radioed in the original target and trusted the Air Force to deliver. Her father had been 24 when he died in Mogadishu, trusting someone would come. Lyra banked hard left on one engine, feeling the aircraft protest, feeling physics and engineering suggest strongly that this was impossible. The A-10 was built to take punishment, but there were limits. She was exploring them now, pushing past where the technical manual ended and faith began. Her hands moved across the cockpit with practiced precision, adjusting trim, compensating for asymmetric thrust, keeping the nose level through sheer determination and 2 decades of muscle memory. The radio squawked, Hawk's voice tight with concern, calling her position, ordering her to climb, to eject, to follow protocol. She clicked the transmit button twice, the universal signal for message received but unable to comply, then switched frequencies entirely. Sometimes survival meant ignoring the voices telling you to quit. The Taliban position sprawled across a ridgeline that overlooked the valley like a medieval fortress. Fighters dug into fighting positions with interlocking fields of fire. From altitude, it would have been invisible, just brown terrain against brown mountains. But down here, skimming the canyon floor at 200 feet, Lyra saw everything. Ammunition crates stacked behind rock walls, heavy machine gun emplacements, mortar tubes angled for indirect fire, even a technical truck with a Zu-23 anti-aircraft gun that tracked her wounded A-10 as she roared past. They hadn't expected her to survive. They definitely hadn't expected her to come back. She climbed just enough to clear the canyon rim, trading precious altitude for one more attack run, one more chance to do what she'd come here for. The targeting pod displayed enemy positions in thermal white against cool black terrain, 47 distinct heat signatures, each one a fighter who'd wake up tomorrow to kill Americans if she failed today. Her left hand found the weapons panel, fingers dancing across switches with the confidence of 10,000 training hours. GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon, 30mm, depleted uranium rounds, 4,000 rounds per minute, the sound of God's own wrath being torn from heaven and delivered express to earth. Chen's platoon didn't know she was coming. Command thought she was dead. Hawk was screaming on the radio now, something about minimum safe altitude and controlled flight into terrain. But Lyra had stopped listening to voices from the outside world. She was listening to something internal, some frequency that only played in moments like this when time compressed and expanded simultaneously, when the space between heartbeats contained entire lifetimes of choice and consequence. Her father's voice, maybe, the one she'd constructed from photographs and her mother's stories, telling her that heroism wasn't about survival, but about ensuring others survived. The trigger sat under her right index finger, cold metal that connected her intention to 30 tons of aircraft, to 7 barrels of rotary cannon, to high-explosive rounds that would decide whether young men in the valley below saw their families again. She squeezed, and the A-10 roared. The sound was biblical, a sustained brrrrt that echoed off canyon walls like angry thunder, like the sky itself splitting open to pass judgment. The aircraft shuddered with recoil, slowing visibly in the air as thousands of rounds tore downrange at supersonic speeds. Depleted uranium shells hit the ridgeline in a diagonal slash of destruction, each round carrying enough kinetic energy to punch through armor plating. Lyra walked the fire across the Taliban position with surgeon precision, watching through her targeting pod as fighting positions disintegrated, as ammunition caches detonated in secondary explosions that sent orange fireballs climbing toward the afternoon sun. The Zu-23 that had been tracking her exploded in a cascade of sparks, its operator visible for one frame as thermal signature, then gone, erased by physics and velocity. She felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not remorse, just the cold professional focus of someone performing necessary surgery. 3 seconds of firing, then she released the trigger, the cannon's barrels glowing dull red, smoke trailing from the nose. Her A-10 climbed weakly on one engine, sluggish and heavy, like an old boxer who'd taken too many hits but refused to fall. The aircraft was dying beneath her, hydraulic fluid streaming from damaged lines, fuel gauge dropping faster than it should, stick becoming heavier with each passing second. But it was still flying, still responding, still carrying her forward. In the valley below, Lieutenant Chen and his platoon stared skyward as the impossible warthog climbed away trailing smoke, as the ridgeline that had been spitting death at them for 6 hours went silent, as debris rained down in a cleansing fire. Chen grabbed his radio handset, called up to battalion, reported the threat neutralized, requested immediate extraction, his voice shaking not from fear but from the raw emotional whiplash of watching death transform into life. Nobody at battalion believed him initially, because the pilot who just saved 32 American lives was officially declared mission lost, presumed KIA, already being processed through the notification system that would inform next of kin. But Lyra wasn't dead. She was 20 miles from base, one engine, hydraulics failing, electrical systems flickering, flying on momentum and stubbornness, and whatever force animates people who refuse to accept the universe's assessment of their limitations. The Afghan sky stretched blue and infinite above her, indifferent to human struggles playing out beneath its expanse. Colonel Voss was dictating the casualty report when someone shouted from the radar station. The blue icon had reappeared on the scope, moving slowly, erratically, but definitely moving toward Bagram. The operations center erupted in controlled chaos, officers cross-referencing identification codes, trying to understand how an aircraft declared destroyed was now squawking friendly and requesting priority landing clearance. Voss grabbed the radio handset himself, something colonels rarely did, protocol be damned. His voice filled Anthem's cockpit, rough with emotion he couldn't quite disguise, asking for status report, asking for damage assessment, asking if she needed assistance. Lyra looked at her instrument panel, at the impossible collection of failures that should have ended this flight 10 minutes ago. Both hydraulic systems red, right engine gone, left engine temperature climbing into dangerous territory. Electrical backup systems engaged, fuel critically low. She keyed the mic, her voice steady, almost casual, the tone of someone discussing weather rather than survival. Bagram Tower, Anthem. One engine, hydraulics degraded, fuel state 200 pounds, requesting straighten approach runway 03. Mission complete. 30+ enemy KIA. Alpha Company safe. Aircraft controllable. The last part was technically a lie. Controllable was generous. She was wrestling a 50,000-pound glider with the aerodynamic properties of a refrigerator, keeping it airborne through constant stick inputs and small prayers to whatever gods protected foolish pilots. But admitting loss of control meant they'd order ejection, meant abandoning the aircraft, meant accepting limits. She'd spent her whole career fighting against people who saw limits where she saw challenges. The airfield came into view, concrete runway shimmering in heat distortion, emergency vehicles already positioned along the approach path, their red lights flashing like warning beacons. Hawk had caught up to her, flying formation off her left wing, his F-16 looking sleek and futuristic next to her battle-damaged Warthog, Beauty and the Beast flying together. He was young, 26, call sign earned through aggressive flying and boundless confidence. Today he was learning that aggression without purpose was just noise, that real confidence was quiet. The landing was controlled violence. Lyra brought the A-10 down with no hydraulic assist, muscling the stick forward, feeling every pound of aircraft weight fighting against her inputs. The runway rushed up to meet her, concrete and distance collapsing into the immediate present. Her remaining engine coughed, sputtered, caught again. Not yet, she thought, talking to the machine like it could hear her, like it understood. Not yet. We're almost home. Touchdown was hard, harder than any landing she'd made outside combat, the main gear slamming onto concrete with a screech of tortured rubber. She deployed the drag chute manually, felt the aircraft slow, felt control returning as speed bled off. Emergency vehicles raced alongside, ready for fire or explosion, for the dramatic conclusion that never came. Instead, the A-10 rolled to a gentle stop just past the midfield point, smoke still trailing from the dead right engine, battle damage visible across wings and fuselage. Lyra sat in the cockpit for a long moment after shutdown, her hands shaking now that adrenaline was fading, now that the mission was truly complete. Through the canopy, she saw Colonel Voss striding across the tarmac, maintenance crews running toward her aircraft, Hawk taxiing up and popping his canopy to shout something she couldn't hear over the ringing in her ears. She unstrapped slowly, methodically, each buckle and connection severed until only she remained, separate from the machine that had carried her through hell and back. The canopy opened with a hydraulic hiss, and Afghan heat poured in like liquid, but it felt good, felt real, felt like being alive. She climbed down the boarding ladder on legs that threatened to buckle, touched concrete with both feet, looked up at her aircraft and saw the damage properly for the first time. 12 feet of right wing missing, tail section peppered with shrapnel, right engine nacelle completely destroyed, turbine blades visible through torn metal, frozen in their final rotation. It was a miracle the aircraft had flown at all, much less fought, much less won. Voss reached her first, stopping 3 feet away like there was an invisible barrier between them, between command and execution, between those who order missions and those who fly them. Captain Cade. Voss's voice carried weight, formality, but underneath ran something else, something that sounded like respect being earned in real time. You were ordered to egress hostile territory. You were ordered to maintain altitude. You ignored direct commands from your flight lead and disappeared from radar coverage. Lyra stood at attention, or close to it, her flight suit soaked through with sweat, her hands still trembling slightly. This was the moment careers ended, where heroism got reclassified as insubordination, where the machinery of military justice ground up anyone who colored outside the lines. She'd known that before she dove into the canyon, had accepted it as the price of doing what needed doing. "Yes, sir," she said simply, offering no justification, no excuse. Voss studied her with eyes that had seen 3 wars and countless pilots, some who came home, some who didn't. Around them, maintenance crews were already swarming her aircraft, photographing damage, cataloging failures, trying to reverse engineer how physics had been temporarily suspended. Hawk stood nearby, his helmet under one arm, looking at Anthem like she'd transformed into something mythical while he wasn't watching. "Lieutenant Chen's platoon is inbound for extraction," Voss continued, his voice softening microscopically. 32 soldiers who were supposed to die today. 32 families who don't get that knock on their door, because you decided to ignore orders and fight on one engine. He paused, let the words settle into the superheated air. The Taliban position you destroyed was preparing for a major offensive. Intelligence confirms at least 40 fighters KIA, 3 heavy weapons systems destroyed, ammunition stockpile eliminated. Ground commanders are calling it the most effective close air support strike of the deployment. Lyra said nothing because what was there to say? The mission was complete, the soldiers were safe, her aircraft was destroyed but she was alive. Everything else was just paperwork and politics. Voss stepped closer, lowered his voice so only she could hear. "Your father would be proud," he said quietly. "Master Sergeant Cade, Mogadishu, October '93. I was a lieutenant then. He saved my fire team before the RPG hit his position." The world tilted slightly, not from G-forces or damage but from emotional vertigo, from the sudden realization that her personal history and professional present had intersected in ways she'd never known. Lyra stared at Colonel Voss, seeing him differently now, not as brass and authority but as someone who'd been 24 once, who'd needed saving, who'd lived because her father hadn't. The tarmac beneath her boots felt suddenly unstable, 32 years of gravity revering itself. "You knew," she said, the words barely audible over the sound of maintenance crews and emergency vehicles. "The whole time you knew who I was." Voss nodded slowly, his face showing the weathering of 2 decades plus of carrying knowledge and debt. "Your file crossed my desk the day you arrived at Bagram. I saw the name, ran the connection, confirmed it through personnel records. Master Sergeant Cade's daughter, flying the same missions he once supported from the ground." He paused, choosing words carefully. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want you carrying extra weight, feeling like you had something to prove. But I watched every mission brief, every flight log. You were always the best pilot in the squadron, Anthem, not because of your father but because you refused to accept that anything was impossible." Around them, the operation's tempo continued. Jets launched for patrol missions. Maintenance crews prepped aircraft. The war machine grinding forward indifferent to individual moments of revelation. But here, in this small bubble of shared history, time moved differently. Lyra felt something release in her chest, some tension she'd carried so long it had become part of her structure. She'd spent her career trying to honor a ghost, trying to be worthy of a sacrifice she'd been too young to understand, trying to fill boots that had been empty since she was 9 years old. "He saved you," she said, not a question, just a statement of fact. "Then today I saved Chen's platoon. Does that make us even? Does the dead ever get paid?" Voss smiled, but it was sad knowing. "That's not how it works, Captain. Your father didn't save me so I could save you. He saved me so I could do my job, so I could save others. So the chain continues." The debriefing lasted 6 hours, intelligence officers picking apart every second of the mission, extracting tactical details, confirming enemy casualties, documenting weapons systems destroyed. Lyra sat in a conference room that smelled like burnt coffee and recycled air, walking them through her decisions with clinical precision, separating emotion from execution. Why she dove into the canyon. How she maintained control with hydraulic failure. The exact moment she decided to re-engage rather than egress. They were building a case file, she realized, documentation that would either justify her actions or condemn them depending on which direction command decided to push. But the intelligence officers asked their questions with something in their eyes that looked like awe, like they were interviewing someone who'd stepped outside normal reality and returned with impossible stories. Lieutenant Chen appeared during the final hour of debriefing, still in his dusty combat gear, still carrying the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd watched death approach then retreat. He stood in the doorway until Lyra noticed him, then entered slowly, respectfully, like approaching a religious icon. "Captain Cade," he said formally, then stopped, words failing him. "What language exists for thanking someone who rewrote your fate, who transformed your last minutes into just another day?" Lyra stood, offered her hand. Chen took it, his grip firm despite the exhaustion evident in his face. He was young, so young, with his whole life stretching ahead now, years and experiences that wouldn't exist if she'd followed orders. "You did good work out there, Lieutenant," she said quietly. "Your target coordinates were perfect. You kept your people alive long enough for help to arrive. That's what matters." Chen shook his head slightly, struggling with emotion. "We were out of ammunition. We'd radioed for extraction, but choppers couldn't land under fire. We were preparing to fix bayonets, Captain. Bayonets like this was Bunker Hill." His voice cracked microscopically. "Then you came through that canyon on one engine and the sky caught fire, and suddenly we had a chance." News of the mission spread through Bagram like wildfire in dry season. Pilots and ground crews passing the story through mess halls and ready rooms, each retelling adding layers of detail, embellishment, mythology. Within 24 hours, Anthem had transformed from the quiet warthog driver nobody paid attention to into something else, something larger, a story people would tell in bars and ready rooms for years after this deployment ended. The squadron gathered that evening in the operations building, official duty complete, unofficial celebration beginning. Someone had procured near beer and actual beer, mysterious sources that nobody questioned, toasting with both because regulations and reality sometimes occupied different universes. Hawk found Lyra standing outside, watching the sun descend toward distant mountains, painting the Hindu Kush in shades of amber and gold. He held 2 bottles, offered her one, stood beside her in companionable silence for a long moment before speaking. "I called you crazy on the radio," he said finally. "When you dove into that canyon, when you turned back toward the target, I was certain you were dead." Lyra accepted the bottle, took a long drink, let the cold liquid cut through the dust still coating her throat. "I was certain too, for about 30 seconds. Then I got too busy flying to worry about dying." She glanced at him, this young fighter pilot who'd learned today that speed and firepower meant nothing without purpose behind them. "You would have done the same thing." Hawk laughed, short and sharp. "No, Captain, I wouldn't have. I would have followed orders, climbed to altitude, ejected over friendly territory, gone home feeling like I'd done my job. You saw past the orders to what actually needed doing. That's the difference between good pilots and legends. The word hung in the cooling air, uncomfortable and too large, the kind of label that felt premature, presumptuous. Lyra shifted her weight, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was, how the last 24 hours had compressed into something dense and heavy, a weight she'd carry forward into whatever came next. The official after-action report arrived 3 days later, delivered by courier to Colonel Voss's office in a sealed envelope that carried the weight of Pentagon oversight. He read it alone first, then called Lyra in, closed the door, gestured for her to sit. The office was sparse, functional, maps of Afghanistan covering walls alongside photographs of aircraft and crew. "Central Command reviewed your mission," Voss said, his command voice giving nothing away. "They analyzed the tactical situation, interviewed surviving members of Chen's platoon, examined your flight data recorder, consulted with maintenance on the aircraft damage assessment." He paused, let the moment stretch. "Their official finding is that you violated direct orders from your flight lead, exceeded aircraft performance limitations, endangered yourself unnecessarily, and operated your aircraft in a manner inconsistent with established safety protocols." Lyra felt her stomach drop, the careful neutrality of military language translating into career-ending consequences, into the machinery of justice processing her actions through established channels. She'd known this was possible, had accepted it, but hearing the words still hit like physical force. "However," Voss continued, the single word carrying weight, "they also concluded that your actions directly resulted in saving 32 American lives, destroying a significant enemy position, and preventing a major offensive that would have endangered coalition operations throughout the entire sector." He slid a folder across his desk. "The Distinguished Flying Cross, Captain, and a recommendation for Silver Star, pending final approval, along with immediate promotion to Major and transfer to Red Flag, where you'll train the next generation of close air support pilots." The folder sat between them, heavy with meaning and metal, with recognition and validation, with the strange mathematics of military valor where disobedience becomes heroism depending on outcome. Lyra opened it slowly, saw the citation written in formal language that somehow captured and missed everything about that day simultaneously. The promotion ceremony was small, intimate, just the squadron and select brass on the Bagram tarmac at sunset. They assembled in formation while Lyra stood at attention, wearing her dress uniform instead of the flight suit that had become her second skin. Colonel Voss read the citation aloud, his voice carrying across concrete and into the mountain air, "For extraordinary heroism in aerial combat against hostile forces." Captain Lyra Cade distinguished herself by heroism while engaged in aerial flight in support of combat ground forces. Despite catastrophic aircraft damage and direct orders to egress the combat area, Captain Cade voluntarily remained engaged with enemy forces, destroyed a significant tactical position, and directly prevented the death or capture of 32 coalition soldiers. The words continued, formal and precise, reducing chaos and fear and impossible decisions into official language, into something that could be filed and referenced and studied by future warriors trying to understand what courage looked like when crystallized into action. But standing there, Lyra wasn't thinking about heroism or citations. She was thinking about her father, about the photograph that sat on her mother's mantle showing a young sergeant with his entire future ahead of him, unknowing that it would end in Mogadishu dust and distant gunfire. She was thinking about Lieutenant Chen and his platoon, about the arbitrary nature of survival, about how easily today becomes yesterday, becomes memory, becomes story. When Voss pinned the new rank insignia onto her uniform, when he stepped back and saluted, when the squadron erupted in applause, she felt the weight of transformation, of becoming something she'd never intended, never wanted, but had earned through circumstance and choice. The Distinguished Flying Cross hung heavy on her chest, metal and ribbon that represented everything and nothing, that was simultaneously meaningful and meaningless, important and trivial. Her father had never received such recognition, had died doing his job, had been buried with standard honors and a folded flag that her mother kept in a glass case. That night, alone in her quarters, Lyra wrote a letter to her mother, something she rarely did, preferring email and phone calls to the slower intimacy of handwritten words. But tonight required the old way, required pen and paper and the physical act of forming language. "Mom," she began, then stopped, staring at the blank page, trying to find words adequate to explain what had happened, what she'd learned, what she'd become in the space between one heartbeat and the next. "I met someone who knew Dad. Colonel Voss, my commanding officer. He was there in Mogadishu, was one of the soldiers Dad saved before he died. Voss told me that Dad didn't hesitate, didn't calculate odds or think about consequences. He just did what needed doing because that's who he was." She paused, pen hovering over paper, remembering her father only through childhood fragments and her mother's stories, through the absence that shaped her more than any presence could have. "I think I understand now why you never remarried, why you kept his study exactly as it was, why you didn't want me to join the military. Not because you were angry at the service that took him, but because you knew I'd inherited whatever gene or curse or blessing made him run toward danger instead of away from it." The letter continued, flowing easier now, words finding themselves without forcing. She described the mission, the canyon, the impossible moment of choosing between following orders and following conscience. She described the fear and clarity, the way time had compressed, the sound of her aircraft dying around her while she fought to keep it flying. She described standing on the tarmac afterward, looking at damage that should have been fatal, understanding that survival was sometimes just luck wearing different clothes. "I got promoted to major. They're sending me stateside to Red Flag to teach other pilots. But I wanted you to know that everything I did, everything I've become, started with Dad. With watching you grieve him but never regret him, with understanding that some sacrifices are worth making because they're the only choice that lets you live with yourself afterward." Red Flag was different, teaching instead of executing, watching young pilots make mistakes in controlled environments rather than hostile skis. Major Cade became known as the instructor who pushed harder than anyone else, who accepted no excuses, who held her students to standards that bordered on impossible. But those who made it through her training became the squadron's best, became the pilots other units requested by name, became the ones who brought everyone home. She taught them the technical skills, the tactical knowledge, the muscle memory that made flying instinctive rather than deliberate. But more importantly, she taught them to see past the mission brief, to understand that every coordinate represented lives, that every bombing run had consequences that rippled forward through time. One evening, 3 months into her Red Flag assignment, Lyra received a package from Lieutenant Chen. It contained a photograph, 32 soldiers arranged on a Bagram tarmac, all holding signs that together spelled "Thank you, Anthem." Chen's note was brief. "We're all home now. We're all getting married, having kids, living the lives you gave us. We named our unofficial unit the Canyon Angels because that's what you were that day. An angel who came through the canyon when heaven itself had given up on us." Lyra pinned the photograph to her office wall, between her flight certifications and tactical maps, a reminder that the abstract became concrete, that statistics were people, that every choice carried weight beyond calculation. Her students sometimes asked about it, about the distinguished flying cross that sat in a shadow box beside her desk, about the silver star that eventually came through channels, about the rumors that had transformed into legend. She told them the truth always, without embellishment or false modesty. She told them about being afraid, about the aircraft disintegrating around her, about the moment she chose to turn back instead of running. She told them that heroism wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it, to see past your own survival to something larger. Years passed, deployments cycled, wars evolved into different wars with different names but similar costs. Major Cade became Lieutenant Colonel Cade, became Colonel Cade, became the senior officer whose opinion carried weight in Pentagon strategy sessions, whose name appeared in tactical manuals as case study in close air support excellence. But rank and recognition never quite fit comfortably, always felt like clothes borrowed from someone else, someone more deserving. She preferred the cockpit to the conference room, preferred flight hours to PowerPoint presentations, preferred the honesty of aircraft and sky to the politics of advancement. On the 20th anniversary of her father's death, Lyra requested leave and flew commercial to Mogadishu, to the memorial that had been constructed years after the battle, to the wall that listed names in alphabetical order without rank or distinction. She found Master Sergeant Thomas Cade easily, ran her fingers across letters carved into stone, felt the permanence of memorial against the impermanence of memory. "I met someone you saved," she said quietly, speaking to stone and ghost, and the young man her father had been before sacrifice transformed him into symbol. "Colonel Voss. He told me you didn't think, just acted, just ran toward gunfire because soldiers needed help. I used to think you were reckless, that you chose death over family over me." She paused, watching Mogadishu traffic flow past the memorial, life continuing indifferent to history. "But I understand now. You didn't choose death. You chose to let someone else live, which is different, which is everything. I made the same choice once in a canyon in Afghanistan, and I survived it where you didn't. But the choice was the same. The willingness was the same." The memorial offered no answers, just stone and silence and the names of others who'd made similar choices, who'd written their final chapters in dust and distance and decisions that couldn't be reversed. Lyra stood there until sunset painted the memorial in shadows and gold, until she could almost imagine her father's presence, could almost hear his voice saying what she needed to hear. She retired at 55, earlier than necessary, leaving active service with full honors and multiple combat commands behind her. The Air Force offered her stars, offered strategic positions, offered everything except what she actually wanted: to step away from the machinery of war and figure out who Lyra Cade was when she wasn't Major, Colonel, Anthem. Her mother had passed 2 years prior, peacefully, surrounded by family and photographs, having lived long enough to see her daughter survive the career that had claimed her husband. Lyra inherited the house she'd grown up in, the study her mother had maintained like a shrine, the boxes of letters and medals and memories that documented a life cut short. She spent her first year of retirement sorting through history, reading letters her father had written from deployments, understanding him not as the absent hero of childhood memory, but as a young man who'd been afraid and brave simultaneously, who'd loved his family and his duty without being able to reconcile their contradictions. Among the papers, she found a journal entry from 2 weeks before he died. "Lyra turned 9 yesterday. I missed it again. She's growing up in photographs and phone calls, and I'm missing it, trading her childhood for something I can't quite articulate. Purpose, maybe. Service. The idea that my absence here means she grows up in a world slightly safer, slightly better. I wonder if she'll understand someday, or if she'll just resent me for choosing strangers over family." Lyra read the words 3 times, felt tears she hadn't cried in decades, understood finally that her father had struggled with the same questions that had haunted her career, the same impossible mathematics of sacrifice and service. He hadn't chosen strangers over family. He'd chosen to protect family by protecting everyone, had understood that safety was communal or it was illusion, that the world her mother and she inhabited was connected to every other world through threads of action and consequence. She began writing her own memoir then, not for publication but for understanding, documenting missions and decisions and the internal landscape of someone who'd spent 30 years in uniform. The writing took 2 years, thousands of pages that got reduced to hundreds, then dozens that actually mattered. She wrote about the canyon, inevitably, but tried to capture not just the action but the doubt, the fear, the moment she'd looked at her fuel gauge and thought, "This is where I die. This is where my story ends." She wrote about her students at Red Flag, about watching them graduate and deploy, and sometimes not return, about attending memorial services and wondering if her training had been adequate, if she could have taught them something more that would have made the difference. She wrote about Colonel Voss, about the strange circular nature of sacrifice, about how her father's death had enabled Voss's life, had enabled her career, had enabled Chen's platoon's survival, about how rescue echoed forward through time in patterns too complex to map. And she wrote about her mother, about the strength required to send your daughter into the same military that had claimed your husband, about loving someone enough to let them walk toward danger because keeping them safe would require breaking who they were. Service is generational, she wrote in what became the final chapter. Not in the simple sense of military families producing military children, but in the deeper truth that each generation inherits the debts and opportunities created by those before. My father saved soldiers in Mogadishu. One of those soldiers became my commander and gave me opportunities to prove myself. I saved soldiers in Afghanistan. Those soldiers went home and became fathers, teachers, husbands, humans who ripple forward into future I'll never see. The debt doesn't get paid. It gets passed forward, gets transformed, gets woven into the fabric of continuing history. She published the memoir through a small press that specialized in military narratives, expected modest sales to relatives and veterans, was surprised when it found wider audience, when book clubs and college courses started discussing it, when reviewers called it essential reading for understanding the human cost of policy decisions, the face behind the statistics. Invitations followed, speaking engagements at military academies and veteran organizations, requests for her perspective on current conflicts and future strategies. Lyra accepted selectively, preferring small venues to large auditoriums, preferring conversations to lectures. At the Air Force Academy, she spoke to cadets who hadn't been born when she flew through that Afghan canyon, who knew her story only as history, as legend, as something that had already happened and been processed into lesson plan. The mythology gets it wrong, she told them, standing at a podium in a lecture hall that held 300 future officers. The stories make it sound like I was fearless, like I calculated the odds and decided heroism was worth the risk. But the truth is messier. I was terrified. My hands were shaking. I couldn't feel my legs. Every warning system in the cockpit was screaming that I was about to die. She paused, let them sit with that reality, with the gap between myth and truth. I flew the mission anyway, not because I was brave, but because I couldn't live with the alternative. Not because I was special, but because I was there, and they needed help, and sometimes that's all heroism is, being present when needed and refusing to look away. A cadet raised her hand, young and earnest, asked the question they always asked. How do you learn to make decisions like that under pressure? How do you train for the impossible? Lyra smiled, recognizing her younger self in the question, in the desire for formulas and certainty, for training that would prepare you for chaos. You don't, she said simply. You train for competence. You practice until flying becomes instinct, until you can work the problem without thinking, until your hands know what to do before your brain catches up. But the decision to keep fighting when logic says quit, that's not training. That's character, revealed under pressure, built through every small choice you make starting today. On the 30th anniversary of the Canyon mission, the Air Force held a ceremony at Nellis Air Force Base, unveiling a restored A-10 Thunderbolt II painted in her old squadron colors, marked with Anthem's call sign and mission tallies, preserved as museum piece and teaching tool. Veterans of that deployment attended, Chen among them, now a major himself, his own career shaped by that day when death had approached then retreated. He'd brought his daughter, 12 years old, the exact age Lyra had been when her father died, creating another echo in the circular pattern of history. The ceremony was formal, speeches by generals and politicians, words about valor and sacrifice and the warrior tradition, language that simultaneously captured everything and nothing. But afterward, in the informal gathering, when rank dissolved into camaraderie and the real conversations happened, Chen approached Lyra with his daughter. Major Chen, Lyra said, smiling at the rank he'd earned, at the life he'd built. And this must be, Sarah, Chen supplied. Named for her grandmother. Sarah, this is Colonel Cade. She's the reason I'm alive to be your father. The girl studied Lyra with serious eyes, processing information, making connections, understanding in the way children do that adults often underestimate. You saved my dad, she asked directly. When he was deployed. Lyra knelt down, putting herself at eye level, treating the question with the respect it deserved. I helped him when he was in danger, yes. But he saved himself too, kept fighting, kept leading his soldiers even when things looked impossible. Bravery comes in many forms. Sarah considered this, then asked with devastating simplicity, "Were you scared?" "Terrified," Lyra answered honestly. "But I did it anyway because sometimes being scared is just proof that you understand the stakes." Sarah nodded slowly, accepting this, then hugged her father with the casual intensity of children who don't yet understand mortality, who assume their parents are permanent fixtures rather than temporary privileges. That evening, alone in her hotel room, Lyra opened her laptop and typed a final entry in the journal she'd been keeping since retirement, the ongoing conversation with herself about meaning and purpose, and the strange architecture of a life built around service. 30 years since the canyon. 32 soldiers who lived because I stayed, who went home and had children who will have children, ripples I'll never fully see. Chen's daughter reminds me of myself at that age, serious and questioning, trying to understand adults and their complicated choices. She paused, searching for words adequate to the moment. My father died when I was 9. I'm 61 now. I've lived 7 times longer than I had with him, but his influence remains, his absence shaping me more than most presences could have. I wonder sometimes what he would think of what I became if he'd approve of the choices I made, the risks I took, the line I walked between duty and recklessness. The cursor blinked steadily, patient, waiting for the words that would come or wouldn't. But maybe approval isn't the point. Maybe the point is continuation, is carrying forward the willingness to sacrifice comfort for purpose, to choose difficult service over easy safety. He saved Voss, who commanded me, who enabled me to save Chen, who will raise his daughter to understand that safety is maintained by those willing to stand between chaos and order. She saved the file, closed the laptop, walked to the window overlooking Nellie's flight line where aircraft sat dormant beneath Nevada stars. The A-10 bearing her call sign was visible in the distance, illuminated by spotlights, transformed from weapon to memorial to teaching tool. It was fitting somehow. Aircraft and pilot both retired but still serving, still offering lessons to those paying attention. Tomorrow she'd fly home, back to the quiet life she'd built after decades of controlled violence, back to writing and speaking, and occasionally consulting for the military on close air support tactics. But tonight she allowed herself to remember fully, without the protective numbness that usually accompanied such memories. She remembered the canyon walls blurring past, remembered the stick heavy in her hands, remembered the moment she decided to turn back toward death instead of away from it. She remembered the sound of her cannon firing, the aircraft shuddering with recoil, the strange calm that had descended once the decision was made and action became inevitable. And she remembered the aftermath, standing on the Bagram tarmac beside an aircraft that should have killed her, understanding that survival was sometimes just luck, sometimes grace, sometimes the universe's arbitrary decision that your story wasn't finished. The stars above Nellie shone with indifferent beauty, same stars that had watched her father die in Mogadishu, that had watched her fight over Afghanistan, that would watch long after her own story concluded. There was comfort in that perspective, in understanding that individual lives were brief flashes against cosmic time, that importance was local and temporary, that the best anyone could hope for was to matter to someone, to change something, to leave the world fractionally better than they found it. Her phone buzzed with a text from Chen. Sarah asked if you're accepting new students. She wants to be a pilot when she grows up. Says she wants to help people like you helped me. Lyra smiled, typed her response. Tell her to study hard, stay honest, and remember that the best pilots aren't the ones who never feel fear, but the ones who fly anyway. When she's ready, I'd be honored to teach her. She sent the message, felt the circle closing and opening simultaneously, past becoming present becoming future, the endless cycle of teaching and learning, of sacrifice enabling service enabling sacrifice. The next generation was coming, would face their own canyons and choices, would write their own stories in sky and decision. Her job now was simply to prepare them, to share what she'd learned, to pass forward the lessons earned through terror and triumph. Sleep came eventually, dreamless and deep, the sleep of someone who'd carried weight long enough to set it down without guilt, who'd paid debts and earned rest, who understood that completion was different from conclusion. In the morning there would be more ceremonies, more speeches, more young officers asking how to be brave when everything suggested retreat. She'd answer them honestly, would share the fear and doubt alongside the decision and action, would demystify heroism while honoring it, would explain that extraordinary moments were usually just ordinary people refusing to quit when quitting made sense. But for now, for tonight, she was simply Lyra, daughter of Thomas, pilot of Anthem, woman who'd flown through fire and survived to tell the story, to shape the next chapter, to ensure that her father's sacrifice 32 years ago continued rippling forward through time and lives and choices made by people who'd never know his name but would benefit from his willingness. The A-10 outside her window stood silent under spotlights, metal and memory, artifact and lesson, permanent reminder that courage was sometimes just refusing to accept the world's assessment of what was impossible, that survival sometimes required flying when all logic said crash, that the space between catastrophe and triumph was often just one more decision, one more attempt, one more refusal to accept defeat. In the morning she'd walk past that aircraft one final time, would touch the titanium fuselage scarred by battle damage and time, would remember the impossible day when she and the machine had refused to die, had fought together through canyon and chaos, had emerged broken but flying, damaged but victorious. Then she'd go home, back to the life after service, back to the quiet work of ensuring the lessons endured beyond the missions that taught them. And somewhere, in a future she couldn't see but could influence, Sarah Chen and others like her would study those lessons, would face their own impossible moments, would choose to fight when fighting seemed futile, continuing the chain her father had forged in Mogadishu dust and she had tempered in Afghan stone. The chain that bound past to present to future, that transformed individual sacrifice into communal salvation, that proved service was never truly solitary but always part of something larger, something enduring, something worthy of the cost.